In the year 2600 AD, the people of Mars prescribed to a pantheon of 13 gods, with each god having a unique ability, a unique following, as well as unique attributes. In previous video, I went over what each god was, who follows them, as well as what they're patron of. For example, Birio is the patron of flight, pilots, and the skies. Georgia is for agriculture and fertile earth. The nameless god has a cult-like following of warrior caste monks who participate in human sacrifices as well as blood contracts. But today I'm going to go over how the gods became what they are known as in the year 2600. This is Simon, welcome to Soapbox, and today we're going over how the 13 became the gods of Mars in the year 2600 AD. If you are interested in what each god stands for as well as their followers, feel free to check out my other video going over the 13 gods of Mars. This video is meant more to show how they became what they are known as today in the year 2600 AD. As a brief recap, the reason why Mars is in such a predicament in the year 2600 AD, we must first go back and look at how they became the way they are. In the year 2281, the New Washington Massacre occurred. 50 protesters were killed by Earth Defense Force military police. The coverage had been taken down by local news stations, but word had gone out. Across the colonies, the video of the uniformed Earthers killing a colonist spread. And this is a very important part of the war between Earth and Mars. You see, up until this point, Earth had been levying crippling taxes from her colonies for over 130 years. And when word got out about the New Washington Massacre, this sparked the revolution. In the year 2282, the president of Earth was shot by an unknown assailant in his car. The Parliament of Earth dissolves as a bomb threat emerges. Weeks later, a cell of terrorists on Mars claimed responsibility. The EDF sent a 150,000 troopers with a Mars of 100 ships to answer this slight. And this is truly where the war between Earth and Mars begins. Now, it would take a year of the EDF's presence on Mars to stoke official armed conflict. It's important to note that between the year 2282 and 2283, the official year that started the war between Earth and Mars, there was a lot of skirmishes and a lot of war crimes occurring. In the year 2283, war occurs between Earth and Mars. It started on the moon, as cells of resistance bombed shipyards and military facilities. The rebellion on the moon ended as swiftly as it began, as reinforcements from Earth arrived, violently putting down anyone who dared stand or speak up. The news channels began blaring sports events as evidence the genocide was deleted. Mars and its moons became a bastion of valiant defiance, the proclaimers of liberty hiding amongst the shadows as the EDF searched in vain. The people of Mars were tough, and they needed to be in order to tame such a lifeless world. There were hardly any resources on Mars. Everything needed for life had to be shipped in or grown in special facilities. Despite this, the colonists of Mars deemed themselves independent in all but name. And it's during this period of brutal conflict where the EDF searches the cities and ecosystems of Mars for the culprits behind the terrorist attacks that we see the introduction of the first member of the 13, Georgia. Georgia is the 10th god of the 13. He is depicted as having green robes, white skin, and long flowing beard with green glowing eyes. He is the patron of fertile soil and agriculture. Now, between the year 2282 and 2283, this is where Georgia emerges. You see, Georgia was a terraformist, and he was one of the first victims of the EDF. While his true name has been lost to history, it's important to note that he was a doctor working with the terraformists, and his eco lab was the first one to get burned down by the EDF searching for terrorists. This blunder on the EDF's part would be what sparks a cataclysmic event that would shape the solar system for the rest of history. Georgia will become the first scientist to openly rebel against Earth. In 2283, he was the one that started spreading information and building the resistance network. However, it's important to note that Georgia wasn't really a leader so much as he was a support role. Throughout the 13's existence in the 7 years of conflict between Earth and Mars, Georgia would be a supportive role. He would be there guiding people, helping scientists, and rallying scholars and doctors. You see, Georgia understood the brevity of the situation the Martians currently found them in. They could not sustain a war between Earth and Mars for very long. Their crops, their oxygen, their fuel, every resource you could think of had to either be produced or shipped into Mars. So to sustain a armed conflict between Mars and Earth would be a harrowing labor. So Georgia goes out and seeks the third god of Mars, Bargain. Now, during the Great War, Bargain was a normal human man. He had no real powers, and he is depicted as being a normal man in a brown suit, even in the year 2600 AD in the churches of the 13. But the reason why Bargain is so important is because he was the one that was able to figure out the logistics of the resistance cells. You see, Bargain was a multi-trillionaire, but he did have a soft spot for the Martians, seeing as one of his siblings died during the New Washington Massacre. And Georgia was able to leverage this emotional weight and help influence Bargain towards the rebellion and resistance network on Mars. Through Bargain's help, supplies began dropping into Mars, and the resistance cells were able to spread via the pirate network. In secret, Bargain would go behind closed doors, influencing boardroom meetings and corporations across the solar system to help the ailing resistance on Mars. With logistics under control, Georgia now had to set out and find more members. The next two members of the 13 that Georgia would recruit would be Mariantor and Birio. Again, Mariantor is the goddess of wisdom and science. She's depicted as having white skin, glowing blonde hair, and having dove wings sprouting from her back. She's the patron of science in the modern year 2600 AD. She was also a terraformist, however, she was not necessarily focused on terraforming as she was on water and recycling and building up the agriculture and food networks of Mars, which was still a very important role. Birio, on the other hand, who would become the patron goddess of pilots and the sky, who is depicted as having blue hair, white skin, golden eyes, was a bit of a wild card. You see, Birio was a known drinker and gambler, often being a womanizer. However, she would grow into a very important role within the 13, seeing as she was one of the best pilots on Mars. There are multiple stories where Birio was able to run through the orbital blockade of Mars, bringing in supplies, fugitives, and spies. With his fellow scientists on the team, as well as a good pilot and now logistics taken over by Bargain, Georgia was beginning to form an actual team. However, he was missing some key components. You see, everyone he recruited up until this point was not really a fighter, necessarily. Sure, they were the best and the brightest Mars had to offer, or in Birio's case, the most skilled pilot, but none of them were really meant for the front lines. And this is where Bellum comes into the picture. You see, at the time, Bellum was in the brig. Bellum was a Marine of the Earth Defense Force, and he was facing court-martial for killing his superior officer. It was in the brig that Georgia came to him and recruited him, promising him riches, wealth, whatever his heart desired. However, Bellum was quite a simple man. He just wanted blood. Very quickly, throughout the 7 years of conflict between Earth and Mars, Bellum would grow into a legend. He was the one that would smash in doors, breach fortresses, and he was known to fight people with his bare hands. He was a ruthless berserker, which is fitting considering in the year 2600 AD, he is considered the god of war. During this time of Georgia recruiting these other members of the 13, he would be approached by someone called Arachni. Now again, Arachni is the patron god of the spiders. You see, in 2600 AD, resources are extremely limited, including computer chips and any type of technology that can replicate computers. To bridge this gap between the need between production and demand, a concept was created called the spiders. Now, the spiders of Mars are cyborgs. The spiders are unwilling slaves that have been given cybernetic abilities. They have brain implants, they have multiple metal limbs, and they are a brutal reality. However, during the year 2283 all the way up to 2300, cyborgs were quite prevalent in the solar system at the time. In fact, a lot of nobles had cybernetic capability, upgrades, and Arachni, whose original name was lost to history, was one of these noble cyborgs. He wasn't necessarily as wealthy as Bargain was at the time, but he was still a substantial millionaire, almost billionaire. Seeing the plight of Mars, Arachni came to Georgia and offered his services. Throughout the 7 years of conflict between Earth and Mars, Arachni would become a legend. He was the one that hacked ship networks, he brought down the data network at multiple points, and in combat, he was known to fight like a demon. At this point in time, Georgia has recruited Arachni, Birio, Bellum, Mariantor, and Bargain. However, the team wasn't quite full yet. He had his fighters, he had his scientists, but he was still missing something. A true leader. And this is where Sol Invictus, Amor, Nema, Solon, and Uranus come into play. You see, Sol Invictus, who would become known as the king of the gods, depicted as having white skin, glowing yellow eyes, and his followers often being leaders, was leading his own resistance network at the time. In fact, during the 7-year conflict between Earth and Mars, Sol Invictus and Georgia were known to be rivals. You see, Sol Invictus was a soldier, a former special operations member of the Earth Defense Force. Sol Invictus had defected and begun leading rebels on Mars. Georgia would come to swallow his pride and recruit Sol Invictus, offering a united front, one resistance, one army, one leader. He even gave leadership of the 13, as they were known at the time, to Sol Invictus. With Sol Invictus's introduction into the 13, this also brought in Amor, Nema, Solon, and Uranus. You see, Amor would go on to become the goddess of love. Depicted as a woman with golden hair and blue eyes, the goddess of love blessed all passion and fertility on Mars. Now, her exact role within 13 during the 7 years of conflict is not exactly known in terms of tactical or any strategic sense. Instead, Amor became what we would know as a social media influencer. It would be Amor's face that was spraying propaganda and delivering her sultry voice across the radio waves, offering resistance fighters words of encouragement and inspiration. organization. Nema, on the other hand, is very well known during the war between Earth and Mars. In fact, she got the most kills. You see, Nema would become known as the goddess of death in year 2600. Prior to that, she is depicted as having glowing orange eyes, black hairs, and her followers are few but loyal. You see, during the Great War between Earth and Mars, Nema would become known as an assassin. It was her blade that found the throats of generals, politicians, and important figures of Earth. In fact, despite being the fact that she's a member of the 13 gods of Mars, she spent very little time actually on Mars during the war. You see, Nema would spend most of her time during the 7 years flying around between Earth, the Moon, the orbital gas harvesting colonies of Venus, as well as the asteroid belt colonies. In her wake, leaving behind a bloody trail of tears, orphans, and assassinated targets. In fact, it wouldn't be until the very end of the war that Nema would actually return to Mars. Solon, on the other hand, the patron god of healing and medicine, depicted as being a bald man with clear skin, glowing purple eyes, was very influential during the war between Earth and Mars. You see, he was what we would know as a medic. Solon was always there. In fact, he is known to have saved the lives of each member of the 13 throughout the 7 years of conflict. In one particular instance, when Bargain's ship was shot down over Mars, Solon was the first one on scene and offered life-saving surgery right there on the spot. Uranus, as I said in previous videos, was not seen very often during the Great War. In fact, he was what we know as a radio operator, but it gets much deeper than that. You see, he was the one that kept the radio waves going. He was the one that supported the network. He was the one that kept these systems in place so that way resistant cells could communicate to each other. And he was also known as a reclusive hermit. In fact, the only real pictures we have of Uranus during the Great War is from sketches and AI-made drawings. Besides that, there's really no physical proof that Uranus even existed or was around during the 13's time. However, each of the 13 do vehemently vouch for his appearance and participation during the war. With Sol Invictus, Amor, Bargain, Nema, Mariantor, Solon, Uranus, Arachne, Birio, Georgia, and Belm all recruited, there are still 2 gods missing. And this is where Hydranos and the Nameless One comes into play. You see, Hydranos, who become known as the goddess of water, was a member of the settlement called Oasis. Before the Great War, Oasis was one of hundreds of water treatment facilities on Mars. It was from these facilities that the Martians could keep life going. As the EDF purposely targeted eco farms and water sustainment facilities on Mars, Oasis quickly became the last city that could. As the war progressed and brutally damaged Mars, Georgia and his members would go to Oasis as a sanctuary. You see, Oasis was neutral during the Great War. This was how they survived and were able to keep producing water for Mars. It would took some convincing. However, Georgia was able to recruit Hydranos into the 13 on the condition that Oasis would remain neutral and self-governing. For a brief moment there, the 13 were actually known as the 12, seeing as the Nameless One was not part of their organization. For the first 3 years of the war, the 12 would lead Mars. Each member that I just mentioned would have their own specific role within the command structure of the Martian army. However, there was one piece missing, the Nameless One. In the year 2285, Georgia was walking in Oasis when he spied a man passed out drunk in a trench. But what's most interesting about this man was that he was surrounded by 7 dead EDF troopers. Georgia took pity on this man and took him in, nursing him back to health with the help of Solon. Come to find out, this was one of the most wanted men in the solar system. You see, the Nameless One, before joining the 13, was a prolific bank robber and data network hacker. He's one of the few men in the history of the solar system to have a bounty exceeding $1 trillion on each planet. Seeing the value of having such a prolific criminal, especially an enemy of Earth, within the 13, Georgia decides to recruit him. And this ultimately would be one of the greatest mistakes Georgia ever made. You see, the Nameless One was a prolific gambler, a womanizer, an addict, and overall not a team player. At every meeting, it would be the Nameless One that would continuously doubt, judge, and bicker with Sol Invictus and Georgia. In fact, the only reason the other gods even kept him around was because he was such a good infiltrator. You see, during the climax of the war between Earth and Mars, prior to the orbital bombardment that ended Mars, it was the Nameless One that managed to infiltrate a warship, the flagship of the EDF fleet, the USS Liberty. It would be the Nameless One that hacks the command module and detonates the nuclear warheads on board. Multiple events like this would be what kept the Nameless One in the ranks of the 13, despite his continuing bickering, squabbling, and overall non-team player attitude. Of course, in the year 2300, the EDF would commit an orbital bombardment, killing millions of Martians. In the 300 years it would take to rebuild civilization, the gods of Mars disappeared. Between the year 2300 AD and 2600, no one has actually seen a member of the 13 since the orbital bombardment. However, despite their lack of presence on Mars, each of these people would become deified. According to the Church of the 13, each of these people died, their souls went to heaven, and they became gods, watching over their loyal followers as they rebuilt Mars. Which leaves one question: are they truly still out there, or are they watching over the Martians? This has been Simon. Welcome to Soapbox. Enjoy his content. Make sure to like and follow.